like to welcome everyone here to the Wampanoag Mill, now known as the Curtain Lofts, and our first lecture, The Mill in Time. My name is James Souza. I'm the Vice President of the Preservation Society of Fall River. Our lecture tonight was inspired because this month, May, throughout the country is National Preservation Month, so that was our inspiration to doing this lecture. Our president, Jim Soul, is not feeling well. He currently is home and will be watching this once we tape it, and that'll be his thing to watch tonight. The revival of the Wampanoag Mills is a Fall River survival story. The name Wampanoag is quite unique. Many of the mills in the city, when they were built, were named after either the owner of the mill or someone who funded the mill also. This one, Wampanoag, is our local Native American tribe that was in this area before Fall River became a city, so it's kind of nice that this particular mill was named for them. The Wampanoag Mill Company was formed in 1871 for the manufacture of cotton textiles. Mill number 1, which is the 5-story building we're in right now, known as the Curtain Loft, was erected a year later in 1872, and 5 years later that whole complex mill over there in 1877 was built, known as the Knitting Mill Apartments. Both monumental structures, part of a largely intact mill complex, all made of Fall River granite. There was one small mill to the right as you came in, and it's fenced in right now. Whoever's in the city would remember Parker Candies. That particular building burnt down, and it was originally like a storage shed for cloth. Fall River made its industrial mark in the late 19th to the early 20th century by becoming one of, if not, the largest center of cotton manufacturing in the country. Up until 1920, there were over 100 mills in the city. We sit here in a community room on what the first floor of once was a thriving weaving machines producing all sorts of cotton textiles, from sheets to curtains to apparel, which were shipped all over the world. These mills, the Wampanoag Mills, closed in 1929. While many mills in the city have succumbed to fire or demolition and others remain underdeveloped, many are experiencing new life as industrial, business, and medical office space, residential living space, restaurants, and more, keeping alive these majestic granite structures that long ago hosed the global leaders of the textile industry and helped build this city. I'd like to give you a little background on our lecturer, John Tschirch. He's an architectural historian, a writer, and a teacher. John received his MA in 1986 in Architectural History and Historic Preservation from the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia. His 30-year career in preservation has brought him across the globe to study historic landmarks and landscapes. He also advises on historic preservation projects and has entered the world of historical fiction writing inspired by his travels. His latest books include America's Eden, Newport Landscapes Through the Ages, published in 2022, and Newport, the Artful City, published in 2020, which received the Victorian Society of America Book Award in 2021. Our lecture, The Mill in Time, is a look at technology, industry, and architecture in the Fall River Mill design. Presenting it, please welcome John Tschirch.
Thank you very much, Jim, and I hope everyone can hear me from my speaker voice. I do have a connection to Fall River. In addition to my love of architecture, I went to Bishop Connolly High School here in town, and my mother's parents grew up here, and my grandmother worked at M.J. Doran's department store, the building of which I think, when I last saw it a few weeks ago, still stands on Main Street. A beautiful glazed ceramic tile building. My grandfather also worked there. He was a floor walker, and she discovered he had written a poem about her called I'm in Love with the Notion Counter Girl. They married. The year was 1929. Their wedding was soon followed by the stock market crash. So they lived in New York for a while, then they came back here to live. So my family has been in Fall River, Tiverton, and particularly in Island Park, where they had summer places at that time. This lecture fascinates me because we're looking at one of the great powerhouses of industrial America. And Jim was mentioning over 100 mills by the 1920s. And another fact, I'm not always big on throwing numbers at everyone, but numbers matter. in an industrial powerhouse like Fall River because it gives us a sense of the scale of this community. It's always neck and neck with people who love to compile statistics that it was #1, or maybe Manchester, New Hampshire was #1 in cotton cloth, or they were a close second to each other, but this was a dominant city. But along with the 100 mills, it was counted at 1 million spindles running, giving it the name the Spindle City. But other things mattered. So I'm going to focus on how the mills were built, how they reflect industrial technology, both practicality and innovation. But let's think for a moment, though, on the city itself. Why Fall River? Well, of course, you're the Quequechan River, and no one can exactly account for it, but it's felt that the name Quequechan was the Wampanoag saying for falling water or leaping stream. So it's the many waterfalls that went down the side of the hill which provided the early water power, #1. But by the 1860s already, the Corliss steam engine was available, developed in Providence, Rhode Island. So factories could be steam powered. What really made Fall River triumphant after that was its location, because you could ship cotton cloth to New York and then Philadelphia, and you were south of Cape Cod, because making your way around Cape Cod without the Cape Cod Canal increased the cost of everything. So Fall River was geographically, environmentally ready for that kind of success. So I want to begin here. Advance the next one. Oh, is it slow on the tape?
Yeah, it's
okay. It may be hard to see the details, but I just want to give you the overall sense of the city. This is Fall River in 1877. Now, Alice Brayton, one of the heirs to the great Brayton family, wrote several books, and she was quoted as saying, 50 mills in 50 years. The real period in Fall River, of course, mill building begins when Colonel Durfee builds in 1811 a mill in what's now near Globe Corners. It wasn't as successful, but by 1813, Mr. Anthony builds the Fall River, what would become the Fall River Manufactory. And then in the same year, Troy City mills are built, and they're extremely successful. But so you see the mills being built, but the really boom period was 1860 to 1890. That's when a large number of the mills were created. And even if it's hard to see, these are bird's eye views. These were extremely popular in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. This bird's eye view technology was perfected with balloons, and many, many cities were creating them because of civic pride in industry. What we find here are the pond systems, of course, what would have been the Quequechan River, and all of the mills flowing down, right? And then all of the grids of streets here and here. There were over 12,000 tenements built in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s to accommodate the workers. And the triple-decker, the 3-story tenement, became one of the character-defining features of domestic architecture in Fall River. When you think of it, Fall River has some amazing landmarks. The old Durfee High School, the Armory, the deeds, records, the old City Hall destroyed, the Academy of Music, churches. But the city really is defined by the factory and the tenement. That's most of the building stock. And what you'll find also is the granite mills seem to be here. The brick mills here and here. I kept scratching my head, why? And sometimes in historical research, the simplest answer is the real answer. It's because the granite quarries were nearby, and it was far too expensive to haul that heavy granite down the hill or above the dam, as they called it. So they were brick. That's simple answer. But what you find too, this isn't just an isolated city. This city was part of an integrated industrial system. The train, the Fall River Railroad was begun in the 1850s, but by the 1860s it combines with the Old Colony Railroad. And the Old Colony Railroad by the 1860s links Boston to Fall River and goes right to Newport, with the Old Stone Bridge being created in Tiverton. So what you have is an integrated transportation system. You have the mills, you have the railroad, and you also have the ships. And reliable steamship service was begun by the 1860s, and we go right up until 1937 when they finally discontinued the Fall River Line steamship. So there was a whole system at work. And here you have the bottom of the hill, shall we say, right? Well before the Braga Bridge and the highways that crisscross this area. Here you see all of the brick factory buildings here, and you have Fall River Line steamships. This is from about the late 1870s, and the train system's coming in. And here, as you see it, the Troy Mill, one of the oldest in the city. Now, we're looking at these granite mills, but again, I don't like to throw too many dates, but I am fascinated by this. Let me just read you a few. Right? Fall River separates from Freetown officially in 1803, an independent community. It's a city that will become known for thread, cloth, and printing on cloth. It's known as Troy from 1804 to 1934. So for 30 years, it's known as Troy City. Then it reverts to Fall River, when it becomes, later on, a proper designated city. In 1811, Colonel Joseph Durfee established the Fall River Manufactory, as I said, by David Anthony. And then Troy Cotton and Woolen Mill here was established by Oliver Chase. Right? He worked as a carpenter for Samuel Slater at Slater Mill in Pawtucket. So here you have, the first purpose-built factory in the United States, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's nearby in Providence, and you have a local Fall River individual who's training there, and he brings that knowledge to Fall River. Now, this was not the original factory. Original factories before the 1840s were just like a big church or a meeting house. They were wood or simple stone, but they were not this massive design. That building burnt down in a fire, and then they replaced it by the 1840s with these grand granite structures, because that's when the quarry develops here. These buildings were the early example of functionalism in design. Well before modern architecture, talked about simplicity in design and functionalism, because this was all about making money. This was about large floor space, and you needed a lot of light. But what hadn't been developed yet is modern plate glass. Modern plate glass isn't invented until the late 1850s. So these are domestic paned windows. You see them right across the street, actually, in those mills. By about the 1915, you have larger plate glass in factories. But here's the stone. Now, the tower was essential because that summoned people to work. And these are in the prevailing style of the time. These round arches are in the Italianate style. Next, please, Alex. But what were the interiors like? This is not a Fall River image, but this is one of the earliest known images of an industrial space. It's in England. England was the first country to industrialize, to harness steam power in the mid to late 18th century, particularly in cities like Manchester, England, in the Midlands. But here you see a large-scale building, flat roof, with that new development, cast iron posts that support the ceiling to, again, support all of the looms. But until the 1840s, they were spinning yarn and they were spinning fabric, but it was being made into things in the countryside. They would ship the yarn out to local farms and villages, and people would complete it at home. So it was partly, weaving had always been a cottage industry, small scale in homes. By the 1820s and 30s, you begin to have the creation of the cloth in the factories, but the finished work was done at home. But then by the 1840s, with increased technology and machinery and assembly line production, you finally completely displace the home weaver and the home assembler. So, let's look at a mill in Fall River, the Flint Mill. Now this is from 1912, but this is a whole series of photographs that I think are a real treasure. They're at the Library of Congress, so it's all public record. You can just Google Fall River Mill photos and come across them. But look at this structure. It's absolutely the English model. Cast iron posts, cast iron beams, but the roofs were wood. Just look above us. This was a real problem for the future of the mill. They didn't have cast concrete until 1900 and after, and they weren't using cement. So one of the problems with mill fires is the fact that when they were oiling the looms, oil would soak into the wood, and thus they could have a conflagration. Fall River was famous for its mill fires. What it enabled them to do, though, these did all the work, so the windows could be larger. So you could have plenty of light coming into this. Again, this is the spinning room. All those spindles at work.
What is the back one?
Go back.
What are the devices hanging from the ceiling?
Yeah, those are part of the machinery to keep the spinning going. You see there are these cables attached to it. So you have these, so think of it as a continuous spin with that cable moving around to keep all those spindles going. Imagine the noise and the speed and the activity. Great physical hazard too for maiming of hands and such. This is the Chase mill. And again, I'll talk about the artist who did these. It's a fascinating individual who recorded all of these. Most of these are from 1912. But this becomes the standard, I'm going to call it, middle Fall River factory along the Quequechan River, granite, with again, the large Italianate tower. And this is meant to resemble a Roman triumphal arch. The large arch in the middle, the two side openings. And again, the bells rang on Sunday for church, and they rang on the weekdays, 6 days a week, to summon people to work. And see the domestic scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stories and no elevator. The Otis Elevator Company would only develop the elevator in the 1850s, and it's not even marketable for buildings until the 1880s. Makes sense of that? Next up. And then you have the advertisement for things. King Philip Mills. Now what happens, you begin to see the scale of the mills become even larger, 1880 and after. The largest scale mills are 1880 to about the 1912, right up till World War I, when Fall River dominates. After World War I, you begin to see the decline and competition from both the South and from Europe. But here you see, and they're advertising all of the things they create. But what you're seeing here is what we call modular architecture. Cast iron, brick, or granite, but still wooden roofs. We'll talk about that in a moment when we go on in time. Here are the Durfee Mills. Maybe hard to read, but it's the plan, and it's very rare to have such a complete plan. So these are granite, of course. Here's mill number 1, 2, and 3 here. Here is the counting house right at the center. Very interesting, the counting house, they wanted every bit of available space for spinning. Every inch. So an office was always in its own small building where they would do business. They also wanted to keep potential customers, other bankers and people separate from the workers. And so you have the mill being developed here. And the next one, Alex. And there you see it in a postcard. You see, here's the back with the Quequechan River, which was the source of all things. And you see the rhythm 1, 2, 3. This is probably the most dramatic of any mill complex. And here's the overview. Now this photograph, it's called HABS. It's Historic American Building Survey. Again, online, public domain, US government. They started these in the Great Depression and moved on. This is from about the 1950s, no, this is from the 1960s because you see the highway, 95, 195, excuse me. But there's the rhythm of the buildings. There's the counting house, right? Here's all the major mills. And what happened is they have to be savvy business people, you know, because we think, okay, they built the factory, but how much floor space do you build? Are you going to overbuild? Are you going to go bust? There's always competition. So in a way, they were quite masterful, Mr. Anthony, Mr. Chase, the Braytons, the Bordens especially. And the Borden family, I'm not doing a socialist report, but the Borden family really dominated. They were in and around and behind everything. Banks, ironworks, trains, transportation, all of it. And they built slowly. They say 1, 2, and 3. These were built at once because there was demand, but then you had continued expansion as the market expanded. And we have to remember, there was a massive economic panic in 1873 and another one in 1893. People think of this Gilded Age period as build, 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 but this was a cannibalistic period in American capitalism. No rules, no worker rights, no banking controls, nothing. And so you had a lot of boom and bust in these industries. And so they were quite savvy in keeping up demand. They were also just lucky because of Fall River's location. It was so close to all the markets, but they also became a single kind of factory town in production. Again, thread, especially printed cloth. It would be their downfall after World War I because they didn't diversify. So the factory type was perfect because it fit that one kind of production. Here's a view of it. Again, with that triumphal arch motif and the Italianate tower. Let's see, 5 stories. And there's a shot of the interior from Historic American Building Survey. Without the machinery, you really begin to see the construction now. You have large floor space, again, thin cast iron. And if the cast iron works hadn't been established in Fall River, it would not have been as successful because they were able to produce their own building materials. Granite, cast iron. They did ship in the brick, but again, once the Fall River Steamship Line and the railroads were established, it was much cheaper to ship in materials anywhere. So it changes the American building tradition. Most people had to build local, with local materials, and then when the train comes in, you can have brick shipped in from the Midwest. It becomes cheaper in terms of price point. Here's the ceiling. I'm going to show you a detail, but this is a wooden ceiling. Next, please. There's the wooden roof. This is the problem with these buildings. And we're going to talk about that in a minute because I have to do this. A few more facts that I think are really fascinating. Here we go, 1 second. Didn't bring my reading glasses. It's September 19th, 1874, the Great Granite Mill Fire. You'll know. 30 people were killed. Many more were injured. And as a result, the city passed ordinances. The factory only had one exit and no fire escapes, so many people had to fall to their deaths. So they enacted legislation that every mill had to have 2 means of egress and fire escapes. So I think this is really key in the history. There was a terrible shirtwaist fire in New York. There were these infamous, disasters across the land over Havana. This is one of the causes. And also, no longer pitched. Yes, Jim?
The ordinance you were talking about after the fire, is that a Fall River thing or a state thing or a federal thing?
It was Fall River. They had no grand federal laws yet. That would not happen until the Great Depression. Things were very local. There wasn't the kind of government intervention of a small government. So that had to be local because in response to this disaster. So all of a sudden you see roofs becoming flat. You see pitched roofs, flatter roofs, and made of cement or another non-flammable material. This is from the Durfee factories. These are the furnaces. Look at that elaborate Durfee monogram. Point of pride. These kinds of, whether it's boilers, furnaces, industrial technology, these were the kinds of things that were featured at the great exhibitions of the 19th century. The first one was 1851 in London, called the Crystal Palace exhibition in Hyde Park. A big glass and cast iron building was produced for it. It was the wonder of the world. It was for Britain to show off its industrial technology. Well, then they had them, Vienna, Paris, New York, St. Louis, all through the 19th century. They were really world's fairs, but they were techno-based to show every kind of gadget. It's these types of things that would have been displayed. And they were a real point of pride. And the whole point was not just to show off technology, but to always make sure you were going towards greater efficiency. I cannot describe every last detail of this. I'm not a technical historian, but my cousin works as a merchant mariner. He works on historic steamboats. And he understands the gadgetry of it as far as maritime and how they kept refining these designs over time. What's interesting is this is where the Durfees are putting their grand monogram. On their china, up at the big house, on their linens, on their carriages, and on these. Real point of pride. Next out. Then we have this, the Durfee Mill, from 1970 by Randolph Langenbach. Again, showing this magnificent tower. These factories from the 1912s right through the 1960s and 70s did attract many artists and photographers, and they're not well known enough. And it's really key. They were catching a fading world, so to speak, in 1970, but they were capturing the monumentality of these buildings that maybe were built for the everyday, but they are these living monuments. One more, let's look at the Metacomet Mill, because this is a complete document from the Historic American Building Survey, plans, drawings, everything. You know, it's hard to read everything here, but it's a really fascinating building. There's the complex. Go to the next one, Alex. There's the main entrance. Now, in buildings that I've said are so utilitarian, they spent a penny for this. This was to impress the customers. This is the entrance. Here you have, this I believe is on Anawan Street. Yep. And I almost couldn't find it because, you know, much of Anawan Street has no buildings on it, if you notice. One building is stuck under the highway. It's almost impossible to find, but it's still there. Here you have, that's a recessed arch, then these Gothic arched windows. Frankly, that's unheard of. This is the fanciest aspect of a mill building I have ever seen. They really went to a great deal of trouble for this, and it's very rare. Fall River culture, the factory owners were all about a penny. I mean, there was not a lot of extravagance. You see grand factory buildings in other places, but this is really exceptional, especially this one, the stairwell. Look at that window. That's an enormous, that's almost a 2-story, 3-story window. Right there. Next, please. Here's the measured drawing of the floor plan. You see the amount of space. It might be hard to see, but here's just one row of cast iron columns and then a second row. Everything's modular, so the spindles could fit perfectly. Right there. Everything was thought out. And there's the side view. Modular, inexpensive, keeping costs down. Alex. And here though, here are the designs. These are the measure drawings for the cast iron posts, cast iron beams. Next, Alex. And it's great detail. Here are the cast iron supports. Here's the cast iron here, but see the rest of it is wood, which again is a concern in industrial space. But again, these are all, again, 1870s, and the most mills were built really between about 1868 and 1890. They kept building them until about 1914, but the majority, there were over, they said 30 corporations, different businesses founded between 1870 and 1890, mill after mill.
Why Southern Yellow Line, when did that become popular in mills? Was it prior to cast iron, or was it after?
It was actually even during, because you had all the pine from New Hampshire, which was pretty close. Now that's protected, or mine it was used for ships. All the big trees would come right down the Piscataqua River, which borders Maine and New Hampshire. It was used for the British Navy when it was a colony. The great pine, one single pine was used for the mast of a ship. And so that's why pine was used. It's used all throughout here. It's even used in grand houses in Newport. Then they would paint it to look like walnut. So that's the main reason. Nowadays, you have to go much further afield. Cedar shingles. When I was in charge of a restoration of a building, used to be for New Hampshire, had to go to Alaska. It's availability. You know? But here you see the simplicity of this, all for economy and efficiency. And there's the bridge coming in. Right, this is a 1960s photo. Next, please. And here, I always can't read that good. This is the Algonquin Print Works, up there at the pond. Look at the scale of this now. Do you see the flat roof? So this is post-fire, post-ordnance. So all the flat roofs, 3 stories, much bigger windows. There's a bigger ratio of window to wall space in these. So these should be coming, this is 1890 and after, and by 1900 you have the Bessemer steel process. Although I haven't been able to get the factory in Fall River, but I haven't seen evidence of as much steel being used in Fall River. They tended to still have cast iron and masonry. It served these purposes. Where you tend to have steel. In the next jump in industrial design is in the 1920s. And that's when Fall River's textile industry is fading and you don't have any need. But Henry Ford is famous for his car plants for efficiency, assembly line production, and the use of steel. And even wider window curtain walls, but you don't find that in Fall River. This is the next iteration. And I'm going to show you a few photographs here. This is called the spooling room. It's a double. This is a glass lantern slide. A stereoscope, excuse me. But again, see the pulleys? Look at all the threads. If you can make that out. Okay. The spooling room, Mechanics Mill, Fall River, Massachusetts. And again, the cast iron. Now this, you see the heavy pine beams. They're immense. Here. Again, one thing I don't see here that I see in other industrial buildings are shallow brick vaults. You see that in some of your houses. You don't see it here. It's flat ceiling with the beams. I love this distant view by a photographer called Wicks from the 1930s, showing the mist rising over the city with the mill here. Next Alex. And here, this is the Getty Institute in California, collects American images from all and world images. And here is a woman from Fall River, Massachusetts, in a schooling room. This was done about 1912. There's a reason for that date. See the next one, Alex? Here's a postcard. Here it says, it's a colored postcard, the weave room just of a mill, of a Fall River cotton mill. They're not identifying it, hand colored, right here, spinning room. But here, Lewis Wicks Hine, 4 girls at a textile mill, Fall River, Massachusetts, 1912. They haven't identified this mill in particular, but you notice the structure is the same. In 1912, Lewis Wicks Hine was a remarkable photographer. He was a sociologist, a teacher, and a photographer, and he was an advocate for social reform. And he was raised in New York City, and he felt that documentary photos like this could be used for social reform, because he was a major advocate to abolish child labor. And he began a campaign in textile mills across the country, but he focused particularly on Lowell and in Fall River. And these are all Library of Congress again. They belong to the nation. They're public domain. So here you have these photographs. They seem very benign, but he's capturing the ages of people. He would then go on and he would record the building of the Empire State Building. Many of the iconic images of workers sitting on steel girders, the Empire State Building, are his. Lewis Wicks Hine. Then he would go on in the Great Depression to photograph the building of the Tennessee Valley system of dams, one of the great Works Progress administration. So he's here in Fall River. The next image, Alex. So these are all from his 1912 collection. This is a spinner. Look at the age, the youth, the child. This is 1912. The Child Labor Bureau was established in 1912. He's taking photographs for them. In 1913, there's an attempt to outlaw child labor, meaning under the age of 13. It was defeated by Joseph Choate, for which the posh boarding school Choate is named after. What a legacy to have defeated protection of children. And child labor was only outlawed in 1938. And that was a shocker when I came across that date. I thought it was a bit earlier. My own grandmother was born in 1908. She didn't work, but that could have happened. So these were major, and they were published at the time. The next image. Here's a dopper taking care of the oiling. Use of that. Next one. And doppers on their break. And next. And the sweeper, one of the youngest, to sweep the factory floor to keep it clean. Next one. And here is one factory. This was done by one of my students at Bristol Community College. I teach photography there, as well as art history, and I have them photographing various buildings. One of my students, and they're remarkable, had said they had to do it, their first assignment is to take pictures of buildings, and he said, but there's no architecture in Fall River. I said, there's architecture everywhere, and there's a photograph everywhere, even in the corner of this room where you think there's nothing. And I thought, that's an issue. And I said, do you think Providence is a cool city? Oh, Providence is really cool. I said, you know, Providence is just like Fall River. There's a colonial section, there are lots of factories. I said, Providence happens to have Rhode Island School of Design, where I also happen to teach. I said, the city reinvented itself. Artists and writers photograph the buildings. I said, there's nothing like a photograph to immortalize a historic site. Once you take a picture of it, it becomes a thing. And so now I encourage my students, and the students go, oh, you're right. I encourage my students to take photos because these are so characterful. I do feel that when you're trying to preserve a site, and you are a preservation organization, I found that from my work in Newport, Rhode Island. Newport, Rhode Island was a collapsing city in the 1950s and 60s. It's considered a shining showcase now, but it was derelict. They thought nothing could happen to it. One of the reasons it was saved is because so many writers and artists and poets and painters had celebrated the historic architecture over time. So we think of them as romantics, right, out there just writing their poetry. But in real world impact, they're the ones who raise awareness. And the reason I also included the Lewis Hine photographs is here's a national figure. who felt that the factories and the people in them were worthy of photography. So when these kinds of things are shared, I've shared the facts of the Fall River Factory, the structure of the Fall River Factory, the reality of the Fall River Factory, how it fits into industrial design, but there's also the social story of what the factory represents. And since this was one of the great industrial cities, you had a great photographer coming and recording them. And so this is an artful photograph, but we hope not every photograph, every factory will remain looking like this in time. That's my lecture for now. I'd be glad to take some questions, or if you want to share any impressions from what I've just said in my sermon.